The handcuffs clicked shut with a sound that didn't echo, but it still felt loud enough to split Frank Miller's life clean in half. Not because he was guilty, but because no one in that courthouse seemed to care whether he was or not. The deputy didn't look at him when he tightened the cuffs, just adjusted the metal, checked the chain, and nodded toward the holding bench like Frank was another box to be moved before lunch. Frank stood there anyway, wrists aching, eyes fixed on the scuffed seal of the state of Ohio carved into the wood floor. An eagle with wings spread wide. Justice frozen mid-flight. He thought of Lucy. Not her face. Not yet. First the sound. The soft knock she made every morning on his bedroom door. 3 taps. Always 3. Careful, like she was afraid to break him. "Dad," she would whisper. "You awake?" He swallowed hard and forced his breathing slow. In. Out. Don't let them see you shake. Don't give them anything to use. Across the aisle, the prosecutor flipped through a file with neat, efficient movements. Mid-40s, grey at the temples. Suit that fit like it had never known a clearance rack. He didn't glance up. He didn't need to. The case to him was already finished. Frank Miller, 56 years old, widowed, former account supervisor at a regional construction firm. Charged with felony embezzlement, falsifying records, and obstruction. The paperwork was thick. The narrative clean. Too clean. The judge hadn't entered yet, but Frank could already feel the weight of the room pressing down on his shoulders. The low hum of the lights. The murmur of whispered conversations behind him. Somewhere a bench creaked as someone shifted their weight. Life going on even here. His public defender leaned in close. James O'Connor, early 30s, coffee-stained tie. Kind eyes that tried not to show how outmatched he felt. "They're pushing hard for pre-trial detention," O'Connor whispered. "They're arguing flight risk." Frank almost laughed. Flight risk. He hadn't left Ohio in 20 years, didn't even own a passport, could barely afford gas to get to work and back. "I won't go anywhere," Frank said quietly. "I can't." O'Connor nodded like he understood. Like understanding mattered. At the back of the courtroom, a woman rose slowly from the gallery and stepped into the aisle. She wasn't dressed like a lawyer. No briefcase, no rush. Late 60s, maybe. Silver hair pulled back neatly. Posture straight, deliberate. She didn't look at Frank, but something in the air shifted as she passed, like the room noticed her before it knew why. Frank felt it. A pressure behind his eyes. The faint, inexplicable sense of being seen. Then she was gone, slipping through a side door, marked authorized personnel only. The bailiff called the room to order. The judge was about to enter. But that moment, that flicker of something unfamiliar, stayed with Frank as he was guided to the bench and told to sit. This was how it had started, 6 months earlier. Quietly, without warning. The morning his badge stopped working, Frank remembered the beep, the red light, the second try. Same result. He remembered the way his supervisor, Alan Pierce, hadn't met his eyes when he said, "Let's step into conference room B," the way HR was already seated, the envelope on the table, his name typed too neatly on the front. They said the numbers didn't add up. Said money had gone missing over 3 quarters. Said the trail led to his login credentials, his approval codes, his digital signature. Frank had stared at the screen they turned toward him. Rows of transactions, dates, amounts, everything in order, everything wrong. "That's not possible," he'd said. "I don't even have access to that account." Alan had sighed, a tired, practiced sound. We all say things we wish were true. They walked him out that day. No raised voices, no accusations shouted across the office. Just a hand on his elbow and a security guard who avoided eye contact. By the end of the week, the police had come. Lucy had been at the kitchen table coloring when the knock came. Frank had told her to stay seated, told her it was just a misunderstanding, told her everything would be fine. He hadn't believed it then either. Back in the courtroom, the prosecutor stood and began speaking. Calm, precise. Words sharpened into weapons by repetition. Frank tuned out the legal language and focused instead on the physical world, the way the bench felt cold through his borrowed suit pants, the faint smell of old paper and floor polish, the pulse in his wrists trapped under steel. This wasn't just about money. He knew that now. Now, it was about narrative, about who got believed. He was a widower, a man who took extra shifts, a man who packed Lucy's lunch every morning and forgot to buy himself coffee, a man with no backup plan and no powerful friends. In other words, an easy story. The prosecutor finished. O'Connor cleared his throat and argued for release pending trial. He spoke of ties to the community, of a dependent child, of a spotless record. The judge still hadn't entered. A murmur rippled through the room. The side door opened again. The same woman from the gallery stepped through now wearing a black robe. Frank's breath caught, not because he recognized her, not yet, but because of the way the room reacted, the way people straightened, the way the prosecutor's posture shifted just slightly. Respect immediate and unforced. The bailiff announced her name. Judge Margaret Collins. She took her seat without looking at anyone in particular. Her face was composed, controlled, the kind of expression that revealed nothing, not even judgment. Frank felt the floor tilt beneath him. She glanced down at the file in front of her, then briefly up at the defendant. Their eyes met for less than a second. It was enough. Something flickered there. Not recognition, not sympathy. Something sharper, like memory pressing against restraint. Frank looked away first, heart hammering, mind racing. He didn't know why. He only knew that for the first time since the red light on his badge, the story in this room no longer felt finished. Judge Collins spoke. Her voice was steady, measured, each word placed with care. She asked questions the prosecutor hadn't expected, about access levels, about audit procedures, about why independent forensic review hadn't been conducted before charges were filed. The prosecutor hesitated, just once. But it was visible. Frank felt it like a shift in weather, the pressure changing, the storm not breaking but gathering. This wasn't mercy. He could tell it was something colder, more dangerous. Judge Collins leaned back slightly, fingers, steepled eyes on the file. Then she spoke again. And with that, the story Frank Miller thought he was living began to fracture into something far larger than a poor single father in borrowed clothes sitting in a courtroom that had already decided who he was. He didn't know it yet, but someone in that room did. Rain turned the street into a sheet of broken glass headlights, stretching into long white swaths across the asphalt as Frank Miller eased his truck onto the shoulder. The engine idled unevenly, coughing like it might stall out of sympathy, and for a moment he just sat there, hands locked on the wheel, watching the wipers fight a losing battle against the storm. He had promised Lucy he would be home before midnight. Promises mattered when everything else felt like it was slipping. Then he saw her. She stood just beyond the halo of his headlights, one hand gripping the open hood of a dark sedan, the other pressed to her phone like it had already betrayed her. Her coat was too thin for this weather. Her hair, silver and neat, despite the rain, clung to her temples. She wasn't pacing, wasn't waving for help. She stood still like someone who understood that panic rarely fixed mechanical problems. Frank's foot hovered over the accelerator. He didn't need this. He didn't need anything else. His back ached. His head throbbed. The courthouse was still ringing in his ears. The questions Judge Collins had asked, the way the prosecutor's jaw tightened, the way James O'Connor had looked at him afterward, hopeful but cautious, like hope itself might be evidence against them. Frank glanced at the clock on the dashboard. 12:32 in the morning. Lucy would be asleep by now. Curled on her side, one sock kicked off the nightlight, throwing soft stars across her ceiling. He pictured the note she'd left on the counter. Be safe. Love you, Dad. The letters crooked earnest. He exhaled slowly. The truck rolled forward on its own tires, crunching gravel as he pulled in behind the sedan and cut the engine. Rain hammered the cab instantly, loud and insistent. Frank grabbed his jacket and stepped out, boots sinking slightly into wet earth. "Ma'am," he called, keeping his voice low, steady. "You all right?" The woman turned. Her eyes were sharp, assessing but not afraid. That struck him first. People were usually afraid at night alone on roads like this. Fear did strange things to posture. She didn't have it. "My car died," she said. Her voice carried authority without volume. "No warning lights, just stopped," Frank nodded, staying a few steps back. "Mind if I take a look?" She hesitated, studying him the way people did when they were weighing risk against necessity. Rain slid down her face. Finally, she nodded once. "Please." The hoodlight flickered weakly as Frank leaned in. The engine was clean. Too clean. Not new, but cared for. He traced a cable with his fingers, water soaking through his sleeves, cold biting his skin. He felt the looseness immediately. Battery terminal. Simple. Annoyingly simple. "You're lucky," he said, raising his voice over the rain. "It's just loose. Might have hit a pothole." The woman let out a breath she'd been holding. "I don't feel lucky." Frank almost smiled. He didn't. He jogged back to his truck, popped the tailgate, and pulled out the small metal box he'd kept since Lucy was a toddler. Duct tape. Wrenches mismatched by size. A flashlight held together with electrical tape. The kind of toolkit that told a story without words. As he worked tightening the terminal, scraping corrosion away with practiced motions, he felt her watching him. Not the way people watched out of boredom, more like she was taking inventory. "You do this often?" she asked. "Fix things." Frank shrugged. "More often than I should." She nodded. "That usually means you've had to." He glanced up at her. then really looked. Rain streaked her face, but her eyes were steady, thoughtful, the kind of eyes that weighed decisions carefully and lived with the consequences. He finished tightening the cable and stepped back. "Try it now." The engine turned over, then roared to life, sudden and loud in the quiet stretch of road. The woman's shoulders dropped, relief breaking through her composure for just a moment. She reached into her coat pocket. "I'd like to pay you." Frank shook his head immediately. "No." "You're soaked," she said. "And it's late." "So are you," he replied. "And you needed help." She studied him again, longer this time. "At least let me thank you properly." "What's your name?" Frank hesitated. Names had weight lately. Names got printed on documents, spoken into microphones attached to accusations. But something about her made him tired of hiding. "Frank," he said. "Frank Miller." She nodded slowly. "Thank you, Frank." He didn't ask for hers, didn't want to know. Sometimes ignorance was a kind of mercy. He watched her drive away, tail lights fading into the rain, and only then did he realize how badly his hands were shaking. The courtroom smelled different the next morning, less stale. Or maybe that was just him. Frank sat at the defense table, jacket drying stiff against his shoulders, and replayed the night over and over. The woman's voice, her eyes, the way she'd looked at his tools, not with pity, but something closer to recognition. Judge Collins entered on time. Robe crisp, expression unreadable. She didn't look at Frank as she took her seat. She didn't look at him when she called the case. But when the prosecutor began outlining objections to the forensic audit, she'd ordered something in her posture shifted. She leaned forward slightly, hands flat on the bench. "Counsel," she said, voice calm but edged with steel. "This court will not proceed on assumptions dressed up as evidence." The prosecutor stiffened. "Your Honor, the state maintains." "The state maintains convenience," Judge Collins interrupted. "That is not the same thing as a truth." A murmur rippled through the room. Frank felt his pulse spike. James O'Connor sat very still beside him, eyes wide, pen frozen mid-note. Judge Collins continued methodical, precise. She questioned timelines, access logs, the absence of independent verification. Each question peeled back another layer of certainty the prosecution had wrapped itself in. Frank watched her hands as she spoke. Strong hands, steady. Not the hands of someone guessing. At one point, she paused, eyes flicking briefly toward Frank before returning to the file. In that fraction of a second, he understood something that made his chest tighten. She knew, not just his name, not just his face. She knew him. The realization was terrifying. If she knew him, really knew him, then everything she did would be scrutinized, twisted, used against her, against him. The hearing adjourned with the audit upheld. Frank was released pending trial conditions, strict but survivable. As he stood, cuffs removed, the weight lifting from his wrists, felt unreal. Outside reporters clustered near the steps. Questions flew. Frank kept his head down, pushed through heart racing. He didn't see Judge Collins leave. That night he stood at Lucy's door, long after she fell asleep, watching her breathe, counting each rise and fall, like it was proof the world could still be trusted. Across town, in a quiet office lit by a single lamp. Margaret Collins removed her robe and sat heavily in her chair. She stared at the wall for a long time before reaching for the phone. The number she dialed wasn't in her contacts. "David," she said. When the line picked up, "It's Margaret. I need a favor." Off the record. A pause, then cautious. "What kind of favor?" "The kind that gets me the truth," she replied. "Before the system buries it." She hung up before he could ask more, fingers trembling just slightly as she set the phone down. Outside, rain began to fall again, soft at first, then heavier, drumming against the windows like a reminder. Some stories didn't end in courtrooms. Some only began there. The first envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped halfway under Frank Miller's front door, like it had always belonged there. Plain white, no return address. His name typed, not handwritten. He stared at it longer than he should have. Coffee cooling in his hand, the quiet apartment humming with the sound of Lucy's old refrigerator struggling to keep up. He waited until Lucy had left for school before opening it. He told himself that was practical. It wasn't. It was fear. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No letterhead. No signature. Just one sentence. "Check the vendor logs from Cedar Ridge Materials. 2 quarters back. Look for patterns, not totals." Frank's breath slowed. Not because he didn't understand what it meant, but because he did. Cedar Ridge. He remembered the invoices. Small amounts, frequent, easy to overlook. He'd flagged them once, months before everything fell apart. Alan Pierce had waved it off, said it was a legacy contract. Said not to waste time chasing ghosts. Frank folded the paper carefully and slid it into his jacket pocket like it might dissolve if he didn't. That afternoon, he sat across from James O'Connor in the cramped public defender's office, the air smelling faintly of burnt coffee and dust. O'Connor listened without interrupting, eyes narrowing as Frank explained. "You didn't get this from me," O'Connor said slowly. "I know," Frank replied. O'Connor leaned back, rubbing his face. "If this is real, it changes things. But if we act on it wrong, it also paints a target." On who O'Connor met his gaze. On everyone. Frank nodded. He'd lived long enough to know that truth came with a cost. He just hadn't expected the bill to arrive so quietly. Across town, Margaret Collins stood in a windowless records room, deep inside the courthouse, sleeves rolled up beneath her robe hair, pinned tighter than usual. Boxes lined the walls. Old cases. Forgotten cases. The ones no one revisited because they'd already served their purpose. David Langley stood beside her, hands in his pockets, scanning the labels with a frown. Late 60s. Former forensic auditor turned reluctant consultant. The kind of man who had retired because he'd seen too much, not because he was tired. "You're asking for trouble," he said without looking at her. Margaret didn't respond immediately. She pulled one box down, set it on the table, and opened it with care. "I'm asking for clarity." David snorted. "That's what trouble always calls itself." She finally looked at him. "You taught me that numbers tell stories people try to hide, and I taught you not to insert yourself into them." He shot back. Margaret's jaw tightened. "This one came to me." David paused. Really paused. He glanced at her, then away. "You met him?" It wasn't a question. "Yes." in a way that matters. She nodded once. David sighed, the sound heavy with history. All right. Show me. They worked in silence for hours, tracing transactions across years, cross-referencing vendors' approvals, timing. The pattern emerged slowly, like an image developing in a dark room. Money didn't vanish. It moved. Small sums routed through layers of shell vendors, each transaction innocuous alone, damming together. David tapped the table. This isn't a desperate man skimming to survive. No, Margaret said softly. It's systematic. And smart, he added. Whoever did this knew where the blind spots were. Margaret thought of Frank's toolkit. The duct tape. The careful hands. The refusal of money. She pushed the image aside. This wasn't about character now. It was about proof. That night, Frank lay awake on the couch laptop balanced on his knees, vendor logs spread across the screen. He hadn't slept properly in weeks. His body knew it. His mind refused to cooperate. He followed the trail the envelope had hinted at, clicking through records he still had access to, through backups he'd made for personal reference. Not illegal. Not then. He'd always been meticulous. The pattern was there, once you knew how to look. His phone buzzed. An unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. "Hello, Mr. Miller," a woman's voice said. "Cool. Controlled. This is Assistant District Attorney Karen Holt." His stomach tightened. "Yes. We'd like to ask you a few additional questions." Informally. Frank almost laughed. Informal. There was nothing informal about the way power moved. "I'll speak with my attorney," he said. "Of course," Holt replied. "But I'd advise you not to make this more complicated than it already is." The line went dead. Frank stared at the phone, pulse hammering. They knew something, or they thought they did. Either way, pressure was building. At school the next day, Lucy's teacher pulled him aside at pickup. Mrs. Reynolds, early 50s. Kind, but cautious. "Lucy seems distracted," she said gently. "She asked me if judges can take dads away." Frank felt the ground shift beneath him. "What did you say I told her judges are supposed to listen?" Mrs. Reynolds replied. "And that sometimes listening takes time." Frank nodded, throat tight. "Thank you." That evening, Lucy sat at the kitchen table drawing tongue between her teeth in concentration. She slid the paper toward him when she finished. It was a picture of a courthouse, a big one, with a woman standing in front of it, holding something that looked like a hammer, and a man beside her, smaller, but smiling. "Who's that?" Frank asked carefully. "That's you," Lucy said, "and that's the judge who's helping you." Frank swallowed. "Why do you think she's helping?" Lucy shrugged matter of fact. "Because you help people, so people help you back." Frank looked away before she could see his eyes. The second envelope arrived 2 days later. This one thicker. Inside a flash drive and a note. "They're watching the wrong accounts. They always do." Frank didn't bring it to O'Connor. Not yet. He drove instead past his old office building, past Cedar Ridge. Materials, past the places that had once defined his routine. He parked across the street and watched employees come and go. Familiar faces. Nervous glances. A black SUV idled down the block, windows tinted. Frank started the truck and pulled away slowly, heart pounding. Paranoia, he told himself. Stress did that. Made shadows grow teeth. At the courthouse, Margaret received a visit she hadn't expected. Chief Judge Raymond Adler stood in her doorway, expression unreadable. "Margaret," he said. "A word." She gestured him in. He closed the door behind him. "I've received concerns," Adler said carefully. "About your handling of the Miller case." Margaret met his gaze evenly. Concerns from whom Adler hesitated. "From people who don't like uncertainty." "That's not my problem," she replied. "It becomes your problem when it looks like bias," he said. Margaret's voice remained calm. "Every ruling I've made is on the record. If someone believes I've overstepped, they're free to file a motion." Adler studied her for a long moment. "Be careful," he said finally. "This case is attracting attention." "Good," Margaret said. "It should." That night, David Langley called her from a number she recognized immediately. "They're moving faster," he said, "and dirtier. On him or on me." "Does it matter?" Margaret closed her eyes briefly. "No." Across town. Frank sat at his kitchen table long after Lucy had gone to bed, the flash drive plugged in files, scrolling past his eyes. He stopped on one folder and leaned closer. There it was, clear as daylight, a name he recognized, a signature that wasn't his, approval codes issued when he was logged out, when he was on lunch break, when he was home with Lucy. He leaned back slowly, the weight of it pressing into his chest. Someone had built this case carefully, and someone was now trying to make sure it never came apart. Frank reached for his phone, fingers steady despite everything. He didn't call O'Connor. Not yet. Instead, he typed a message to the number he didn't know would respond. "I see it now." He stared at the screen, then added one more line. "So do they." The reply came almost instantly. "Then we don't have much time." Outside, the streetlight flickered, casting long shadows across the pavement. Frank watched them stretch and shift, thinking of storms and courtrooms and the quiet decisions people made when they thought no one was looking. The story was no longer just about whether he would be believed. It was about who was willing to tell the truth when belief became dangerous. The knock came at 5:42 in the morning sharp and measured the kind that assumed compliance rather than asked for it. Frank Miller was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop closed and the flash drive hidden beneath a folded placemat, listening to the building wake up around him. Pipes groaned. A neighbor's radio murmured low. Lucy breathed softly through the wall, steady and unaware. He stood slowly, careful not to make noise, and opened the door. Two men, dark jackets, no smiles. One held a thin folder like it weighed nothing. The other watched the hallway with the detached alertness of someone trained to expect resistance. "Frank Miller," the man with the folder said. "We need to ask you a few questions." Frank didn't move. "Do I need a lawyer?" The man's eyes flicked briefly to the apartment behind him. "You're not under arrest." "That didn't answer my question," Frank said. A pause. Then, "You can call one if you like." Frank nodded once. Then you can wait." He closed the door gently and leaned his forehead against the wood for a moment, letting the fear pass through without taking root. He texted James O'Connor. Short, precise. 2 men. Now. He slid the phone into his pocket and opened the door again. They stepped inside without being invited. They asked about Cedar Ridge materials, about vendor approvals, about backups. Their questions came quick, layered, designed to trip him. Frank answered only what was asked, nothing more. His voice, even his hands, resting flat on the table where they could be seen. When Lucy padded into the kitchen in her socks, hair tangled, clutching her stuffed bear, the man without the folder shifted uncomfortably. "Daddy?" she asked. Frank turned immediately, his face softening. "Go get dressed, Lou. School day." She studied the men with solemn curiosity. "Are they judges?" "No," Frank said gently. "They're just asking questions." She nodded, as if that made sense, and disappeared back into her room. The men exchanged a look. The one with the folder closed it. "We'll be in touch," he said, already moving toward the door. Frank watched them leave the hallway, swallowing their footsteps. His phone buzzed a second later. "On my way. Don't say anything else. O'Connor." Frank exhaled slowly and went to make breakfast like nothing had happened. Across town, Margaret Collins sat in her car outside the courthouse engine, off hands resting on the steering wheel. She had arrived earlier than usual, the sky still a pale gray that promised rain. The call from David Langley had come just before dawn. "They're trying to scare him," David had said, "and they're circling you." Margaret closed her eyes briefly, then opened them with resolve. "Then it's time." She walked into chambers and locked the door behind her. The file on Frank Miller lay open on her desk, pages marked with neat tabs. She pulled a legal pad toward her and began to write outlining steps, contingencies, consequences. Each decision carried weight. Each path closed others. When Chief Judge Adler knocked, she didn't look up. "Come in." He entered, brows knit. "You should have told me." "Told you what?" she asked. "That you were escalating," Adler said. "That you were bringing in external forensic review." Margaret met his gaze. "I followed procedure." "You followed the letter," he countered. "Not the spirit." She stood slowly, hands braced on the desk. "The spirit of the law is to find the truth." Adler sighed. "This office is under pressure." "So am I," Margaret said. "And I won't sacrifice an innocent man to make it easier." Adler studied her for a long moment. "If this blows back on you." "It already has," she replied. The door closed behind him with a soft finality. By mid-morning, the courthouse buzzed with whispers. Motions filed. Objections lodged. The prosecution requested a closed-door conference. Margaret granted it. In the conference room, the assistant district attorney. Karen Holt sat rigidly, lips pressed thin. She spoke first. "Your Honor, we have reason to believe the defendant has been tampering with evidence." Margaret's eyes were steady. "You have reason, or you have proof?" Holt hesitated. "We have concerns." "Concerns are not admissible," Margaret said. "Evidence is." Holt's jaw tightened. "This case has implications beyond one man." Margaret leaned forward slightly. Then perhaps it should have been handled with more care from the beginning. The room went quiet. Holt gathered her papers, stood abruptly and left without another word. That afternoon, James O'Connor sat across from Frank, reading through files with growing intensity. "This is it," he said quietly. "This is the break." Frank nodded. "They came this morning." O'Connor looked up sharply. "What 2 men?" "Questions." "No warrant." O'Connor swore under his breath. "They're spooked." "Should I be frank?" asked. O'Connor met his eyes. "You should be careful." That evening Frank tucked Lucy into bed, lingering longer than usual. She watched him with a seriousness beyond her years. "Are you scared?" she asked. Frank considered lying. He didn't. A little. She reached out and took his hand, small and warm. "It's okay. I'm brave enough for both of us." He smiled, tears burning behind his eyes. "I know you are." The 3rd envelope arrived the next day, delivered by hand. No stamp, no return address. Inside a single page of printed text and a photograph. The photograph showed a conference room, men in suits, a familiar face at the head of the table. Alan Pierce. The text was brief. "They're preparing a narrative. Make sure yours is louder." Frank stared at the image, the memories flooding back. Alan's easy smile, his dismissive wave. The day everything had cracked. He forwarded the photo to O'Connor. Then, after a moment's hesitation, he typed another message. "I need to testify." The reply came slower this time. "That's risky." "So is silence," Frank wrote. At the courthouse, Margaret received an anonymous packet through internal mail. No cover letter, just documents, bank records, vendor invoices, a timeline annotated in precise handwriting. She recognized David's work immediately. Her phone rang. Unknown number. "Judge Collins," a voice said. "This is Raymond Adler." "Yes," she replied. "There's going to be a formal complaint filed against you," Adler said. "By the end of the week." Margaret closed her eyes. On what grounds bias? Overreach? Impropriety? She absorbed the words, feeling their weight settle. "Thank you for telling me." "I'm not warning you," Adler added. "I'm asking you to prepare." "I am," Margaret said, and hung up. She looked down at the packet, then at the framed photo on her desk. Her parents. Long gone, people who had taught her that rules mattered, but conscience mattered more. She straightened, gathered the documents, and placed them carefully into the file. The storm broke that night rain, lashing the city with renewed fury. Frank sat at his table testimony notes, spread before him, while Lucy slept down the hall. Margaret sat in her chambers, drafting an order that would force the truth into daylight. Neither of them knew what the morning would bring, but both knew there was no turning back. The courtroom filled early, the kind of early that carried intention. People arrived before they were required to take seats. They hadn't been assigned, leaned forward as if proximity might grant influence. Frank Miller stood just inside the doorway. Jacket buttoned too tight. Fingers brushing the edge of the defense table as if to confirm it was real. James O'Connor murmured something about breathing. Frank nodded, though his chest felt packed with wet concrete. Across the aisle, the prosecution team arranged their files with unusual care. Karen Holt avoided looking in his direction. That alone told Frank everything had changed. When Judge Margaret Collins entered the room, snapped to attention. No murmurs, no shuffling. She took her seat slowly, deliberately, eyes scanning the room without settling on anyone. Not on Frank, not on Holt, not on the observers packed into the back rows. Authority radiated from stillness. "This court is in session," she said, and the words carried weight. The first witness was called. A forensic accountant contracted by the state. Clean resume, polished testimony. He spoke of standard procedures of thresholds and tolerances of how anomalies could occur without malicious intent. Frank listened jaw tight, recognizing the language. It was the language of plausible deniability. When cross-examination began, O'Connor stood, voice steady. He didn't attack. He asked about scope, about what had not been reviewed, about why certain vendor accounts were excluded from analysis. The accountant hesitated. Just a fraction too long. Judge Collins leaned forward slightly. "Answer the question," she said. The accountant cleared his throat. Those accounts were deemed outside the initial parameters. By whom, Collins asked. A pause. By the firm. Which firm, she pressed. The answer landed flat. Cedar Ridge Materials. A murmur rippled through the room. Frank felt his pulse spike. He kept his eyes down. The prosecution objected. Judge Collins overruled. Her voice remained calm, but there was an edge now sharp enough to cut through resistance. By midday, the narrative the state had prepared began to fray. Documents contradicted testimony. Timelines didn't align. The jury shifted in their seats, attention sharpening. Then it was Frank's turn. He stood slowly, every movement measured. The oath felt heavier than he expected. When he sat, he placed his hands flat on the table, grounding himself. He didn't look at the jury at first. He looked at Judge Collins. She gave nothing away. O'Connor began gently. Background. Work history. The day the badge stopped working. Frank spoke plainly without embellishment. He described procedures, checks, red flags he'd raised, emails that went unanswered. Then the prosecutor took over. Karen Holt approached like a storm front, questions rapid fire. She pushed at inconsistencies, implied negligence, suggested motive. Frank answered each one voice, steady, refusing to rise to the bait. "Isn't it true," Holt said sharply, "that you were under financial stress?" Frank didn't hesitate. "Yes." "And isn't it true that you had access to the accounts in question?" "I had access to review," he replied. "Not to authorize." Holt's eyes narrowed. "Yet the approvals bear your credentials." "They bear my credentials being used," Frank said evenly. "Not by me." Holt leaned closer. "You expect this jury to believe that someone framed you, and you never noticed." Frank met her gaze. "I noticed. I reported it. It was dismissed." Silence stretched. "By whom?" Holt demanded. Frank took a breath. "By Alan Pierce." The name hung in the air like smoke. Judge Collins's eyes flicked briefly to the gallery, then back to Frank. "Proceed," she said. O'Connor redirected, introducing the flash drive into evidence. The forensic report David Langley had prepared meticulous and damning. The vendor shell structure, the timing of approvals when Frank was logged out, the trail that led unmistakably away from the defense table. The prosecution objected again. Too late. The foundation had been laid. As the evidence unfolded, Frank felt something unfamiliar settle over him. Not relief, not triumph, something quieter. Vindication wasn't loud. It didn't cheer. It simply existed. When Alan Pierce was called, the room shifted. Pierce took the stand with practiced confidence, smile-tight eyes calculating. He spoke of misunderstandings, of oversight, of how unfortunate it was that Frank had been mistaken. Judge Collins watched him closely. Her questions came without warning, precise and surgical. "Mr. Pierce," she said, "can you explain why your login credentials appear on approval codes issued during periods you claimed to be out of the office?" Pierce faltered. "Just enough. And can you explain," she continued, "why those approvals coincide with transfers to accounts linked to your personal investment entities?" The silence that followed was absolute. Pierce stammered. The prosecutor stood abruptly. "Objection." Judge Collins didn't raise her voice. "Sit down," she said. The gavel remained untouched. By late afternoon, the jury had heard enough. Judge Collins dismissed them to deliberate, then called counsel forward. Her expression was unreadable. "I have received a formal complaint regarding my conduct in this case," she said calmly. "It has been filed with the Judicial Review Board." A murmur rippled through the room. Frank's heart lurched. Judge Collins continued. "That complaint does not alter this court's obligation to rule on the evidence before it." She looked directly at Frank then. For the first time. No recognition. No warmth. Just truth. "This court finds that the charges against Frank Miller are unsupported by credible evidence. All counts are dismissed with prejudice." The room erupted. Frank heard nothing. The words echoed inside him, reverberating against months of fear. Judge Collins raised her hand once and the room quieted. "This court further orders that the findings of this forensic review be referred to the Attorney General's office for immediate action." She struck the gavel. Once. Frank sank into his chair, breath leaving him in a rush. O'Connor gripped his shoulder, laughing and swearing at the same time. Across the aisle, Karen Holt gathered her files without looking up. Judge Collins stood already turning away, robe flowing. She didn't look back. Outside, cameras waited. Questions shouted. Frank pushed through, blinking in the daylight. He felt unsteady, like gravity had shifted. His phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "It's over. Go home." Frank typed back with shaking fingers. "Thank you." The reply came moments later. "Live well. That's enough." That evening, Frank picked Lucy up from Mrs. Reynolds's house. Lucy ran to him, wrapping her arms around his waist with a force that knocked the breath from him. "You're smiling," she said, pulling back to look at him. "Did the judge fix it?" Frank knelt, meeting her eye level. She listened. Lucy nodded solemnly. "That's better." As they walked home, the city felt different, quieter. Or maybe that was just him. Across town, Margaret Collins sat alone in her chambers, complaint letter open on her desk. She read it once, then closed the folder. Outside her window, the sky cleared the storm finally spent. She had done her duty. The rest would come as it came. For now justice had spoken, and that she knew was worth whatever followed. The silence afterward was heavier than the fear had ever been. Frank Miller felt it the first morning he woke up without a court date circled in red on the calendar, without the low-grade panic humming beneath every thought. He stood in the kitchen holding a mug he'd reheated twice, staring at the window as if the world outside might look different now that the weight had lifted. It didn't. Cars still passed. A siren wailed somewhere in the distance. Life kept moving indifferent to verdicts. Lucy padded in hair, wild, still half asleep. She stopped when she saw his face. "You're doing the quiet smile," she said. Frank blinked, then laughed softly. "I am." "That means you're thinking too hard, but you're not," she said, climbing into a chair. "Is that good?" He nodded, crouching to her level. "That's very good." At school, drop off. Other parents looked at him differently, some with curiosity, some with sympathy that hadn't quite expired. Mrs. Reynolds hugged him longer than usual and whispered, "I'm glad, like it was a secret worth protecting." Frank thanked her and walked back to his truck, feeling strangely exposed. Being cleared didn't erase the months of being suspected. It just rearranged the memory of it. By the end of the week, the calls started. Journalists first. Frank didn't answer. Then a former co-worker who'd never believed the charges but hadn't spoken up either. Then a lawyer from a firm downtown asking if he'd considered civil action. Frank listened politely and declined. He wasn't interested in spectacle. He wanted stability. Across the city, Margaret Collins sat in a conference room facing 3 members of the Judicial Review Board. The complaint lay on the table between them, crisp and formal. Bias, impropriety, overreach. The words were familiar. They'd been used before always when someone pressed too hard. She answered their questions calmly without defensiveness. She spoke of procedure, of precedent, of evidence. She didn't mention Frank, didn't mention rain or a broken-down car or a tool kit held together with tape. Those things didn't belong here. When the meeting ended, the chair cleared his throat. "We'll be in touch." Margaret nodded and left spine straight, hands steady. Outside the courthouse steps felt steeper than usual. That afternoon, Frank found a note taped to his truck windshield. No envelope this time, just paper folded once. "You're free. Don't waste it." He smiled despite himself and tucked it into his wallet. The first time he ran into Margaret Collins after the trial, it wasn't dramatic. No courthouse, no reporters. Just a grocery store on a quiet Wednesday evening. Frank was reaching for a loaf of bread when he felt it, that subtle shift in the air, the sense of recognition arriving before logic. She stood 2 aisles over, comparing labels on jars of pasta sauce. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Margaret looked up and met his eyes. No robe, no bench, just a woman in a dark coat with a tired expression and a cart that held little more than soup and tea. Frank nodded once. She returned it. They stood there surrounded by the ordinary sounds of life, the beep of a scanner, the murmur of conversation, the squeak of cart wheels. Finally, she spoke. "You look well," she said. "So do you," Frank replied. "Thank you for listening." Margaret's mouth tightened slightly. "It was my job." Frank shook his head. "No, it was your choice." She considered that, then nodded. "How's your daughter braver than me?" he said. "She thinks you have a magic hammer." A hint of a smile flickered. "I'll have to live up to that." They didn't linger, didn't exchange numbers. They paid for their groceries and went their separate ways. The encounter settling into Frank's chest like a quiet assurance rather than a promise. Life reshaped itself slowly. Frank found work at a hardware store owned by a man who valued reliability over polish. The hours were better. The pay was steady. He came home in time for dinner. Lucy covered the refrigerator with drawings of houses and hammers and stick figures that always held hands. One evening, she looked up from her homework and said, "Do you think bad people get scared when they get caught?" Frank thought of Alan Pierce in the courtroom, the way confidence drained from his face. "I think they get scared when the truth doesn't listen to excuses." Lucy nodded, satisfied. "Good." Weeks passed. The world moved on. But consequences had a way of catching up to those who'd tried to outrun them. The news broke quietly on a Friday afternoon. Alan Pierce had been indicted on multiple counts of fraud. The story barely made the front page. Margaret read it alone in her chambers and closed the paper without comment. The review board's letter arrived the following Monday. No suspension, no formal reprimand. A reminder of ethical boundaries and a recommendation for procedural clarity. Margaret read it once, then filed it away. The cost had been less than she'd feared, more than she'd hoped. Acceptable. That Sunday, Frank and Lucy sat in the back pew at church, Lucy swinging her legs, humming softly. After the service, Margaret approached them, hands clasped, posture formal, but not distant. "I was wondering," she said carefully, "if Lucy might like to show me her drawings sometime, if that's all right." Lucy's eyes lit up. "The hammer ones, or the new ones?" Margaret smiled fully this time. "All of them." Frank hesitated, then nodded. "We'd like that." They met for coffee the following week. Neutral ground, daylight. Lucy talked non-stop, explaining her pictures with authority, correcting Margaret when she misunderstood details. Frank watched the two of them, something easing inside him. There was no rush, no grand gesture, just conversation. Margaret spoke of her parents, of growing up believing rules were the same as fairness, of learning otherwise. Frank listened, recognizing the cost of those lessons. As the months went on, their meetings became routine. Not frequent, intentional. Lucy accepted Margaret's presence without question, as children do when something feels right. Frank found himself laughing more, sleeping better. One evening as they walked to their cars after dinner, Margaret paused. "I should tell you something," she said. Frank waited. "I may step down next year," she continued. "Early retirement." He studied her face. "Is that because of me?" She shook her head. "No. It's because I'm tired of mistaking endurance for virtue." Frank nodded slowly. "Whatever you choose, you did good." She met his gaze, eyes searching. "So did you." As Frank drove home, Lucy asleep in the back seat, he thought of the man he'd been a year ago. Afraid, invisible, easy to overlook. He hadn't gained power or money. He'd gained something harder to name. Margaret watched from her car as they pulled away, then turned toward her own road. The city lights stretched ahead, familiar and changed all at once. Some stories ended with applause. This one didn't. It ended with mornings that felt lighter evenings that felt earned, and the quiet knowledge that when the moment came, two people had chosen to stop to look and to do what was right. That was enough. The letter arrived on a quiet Thursday, the kind of afternoon where the sky couldn't decide what it wanted to be. Grey, but not threatening. Calm, but not warm. Frank Miller found it folded neatly on the kitchen table when he came home from work. Lucy already at Mrs. Reynolds' place down the hall, the apartment too still for his liking. Margaret Collins's name was typed on the front. No title, no seal. He didn't open it right away. He set his keys down, washed his hands, and stood by the sink longer than necessary, staring at the small crack in the tile that had been there since before Lucy could walk. Some things stayed, some things didn't. He'd learned the difference the hard way. When he finally unfolded the paper, the message was short. I've been offered a position in Columbus. Policy advisory. No bench, no gavel. I haven't accepted yet. I wanted you to know before it becomes public. Frank read it twice, then once more. Columbus wasn't far, but it wasn't close either. Far enough to change routines. Far enough to make absence noticeable. He folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into the envelope, feeling the familiar pull of uncertainty settle into his chest. Not fear. Not this time. Something quieter. Something that asked questions instead of answering them. That evening, Lucy sensed it immediately. She always did. You're thinking too loud again, she said, legs tucked beneath her, as she colored at the table. Is it the judge lady? Frank smiled despite himself. She has a name. I know, Lucy said. But Judge Lady is cooler. He sat across from her. She might be moving. Lucy's marker paused mid-stroke. Away. Not forever, he said carefully. Just farther. Lucy considered this, then shrugged. People move. You moved once. That was different, Frank said. Lucy tilted her head. Because you didn't want to. He didn't answer right away. She went back to coloring, satisfied she'd said enough. The next time Frank saw Margaret, it was at the library. Sunday afternoon. Lucy had insisted on returning her books herself, marching up to the desk with exaggerated seriousness. Margaret stood near the history shelves, reading glasses perched low, flipping through a thick volume like time was a suggestion rather than a rule. Frank approached quietly. You always read the hard stuff. Margaret looked up, startled, then smiled. Only when I need reminding that people have made worse mistakes than I have. Lucy waved. I found the book about volcanoes. Margaret knelt slightly. That's a good choice. They're powerful. Lucy nodded solemnly. But dangerous. Yes, Margaret agreed. That too. They walked out together, the late afternoon light slanting across the parking lot. Frank didn't mention the letter at first. Neither did Margaret. Silence, when chosen, felt different, less like avoidance, more like respect. At the cars, Frank finally spoke. I got your note. Margaret nodded. I thought you might. You don't have to explain, he said. I just wanted to know why. She leaned against her car, considering him. Because I've spent most of my life reacting, deciding what to fix once it's already broken. I want to work upstream for a while. Frank absorbed that. Sounds like you've earned it. She met his gaze. What do you want, Frank? The question wasn't casual. It wasn't loaded either. It was precise. Like a well-crafted argument. He thought of mornings without panic, of Lucy's laughter filling rooms that used to echo, of work that ended before dark, of a life no longer built entirely on defense. I want things to stay honest, he said finally. Even if they change. Margaret smiled faintly. That's all any of us can do. The decision didn't come quickly. Weeks passed. Margaret took the position. Frank kept his job. Lucy started a new art class and announced she wanted to be an architect because buildings didn't lie if you built them right. They adjusted. Visits became less frequent, but more intentional. Phone calls longer. Letters sometimes handwritten, arriving in the mail like artifacts from a slower world. One evening, months later, Frank drove to Columbus with Lucy asleep in the back seat, her head tilted against the window breath, fogging the glass. The city lights felt unfamiliar, but not hostile. Margaret met them outside her building coat, pulled tight hair loose. Lucy woke up and immediately reached for her. You moved, she said. Accusation softened by excitement. Margaret laughed. I did. Is it better? Lucy asked. Margaret glanced at Frank, then back at Lucy. It's different. Different can be good. They ate dinner at a small place down the street. No one recognized Margaret. No one cared. Frank watched her relax in ways he hadn't seen before. Shoulders lower, laughter easier. Later, walking back to the car, Margaret slowed. I don't know what this looks like from the outside, she said quietly. Or what it becomes. Frank nodded. Neither do I. She stopped, turned to face him. But I know what it feels like. So do I, he said. They didn't kiss. Not then. They stood there, the city humming around them. Lucy already climbing into the back seat, singing softly to herself. It wasn't a moment built for drama. It was built for endurance. On the drive home, Lucy spoke without opening her eyes. You should tell her you're not afraid anymore. Frank smiled into the dark. I think she knows. Back in Ohio, life resumed its steady rhythm, but something subtle had shifted. Frank noticed it in the way he stood straighter, in the way he spoke more freely, in the way he no longer felt invisible in rooms that once swallowed him whole. Margaret noticed it too from a distance, in herself, in the absence of constant vigilance, in the quiet satisfaction of work that aimed to prevent harm instead of clean it up. They didn't call it love. Not yet. They didn't need to. Labels had a way of narrowing things that deserved space. What they shared was simpler and harder to break. Mutual recognition. A shared refusal to look away. The knowledge that when the world pressed in, they had both chosen in their own ways to push back. Frank tucked Lucy into bed one night, months later, and she looked up at him with sudden seriousness. Do you think people can be brave without being loud? She asked. He considered the question, thinking of courtrooms and rain, and letters written carefully in quiet rooms. "Yes," he said. "I think that's the best kind." Lucy nodded, satisfied, and rolled onto her side. Frank stood in the doorway for a long moment, then turned off the light. Some stories didn't rush toward an ending. They unfolded one honest choice at a time. The phone rang at 4:17 in the morning, cutting through the apartment like a blade. Frank Miller woke instantly, heart already racing before his mind could catch up. Lucy slept on curled tight beneath her blanket, the steady rhythm of her breathing anchoring the room. He reached for the phone, thumb hovering for a split second before he answered. Frank Margaret Collins' voice said. It was calm but not steady. "I'm sorry to call this early." He sat up. "What happened?" "There's a hearing today," she said. "Emergency. The Attorney General's office filed a motion overnight. They're reopening aspects of the Pierce investigation, not to retry you, but to examine procedural failures." Frank rubbed his face. "That sounds like their problem." "It should be," Margaret said. "But my name is in the footnotes. They're questioning whether I should have been recused." Silence filled the space between them. Frank glanced toward Lucy's room, then back to the window, where the first hint of dawn pressed against the dark. "What does that mean?" he asked. "It means I may be called to testify," Margaret replied. "Publicly." Frank closed his eyes. He could already see the headlines forming, the careful language stripped of nuance. Judge oversteps. Conflict of interest. Questions raised. "You didn't do anything wrong," he said. "I know," she replied. "But knowing and proving are different things." By the time Frank dropped Lucy off at school, the sky had turned a flat, unforgiving grey. He drove to work, but barely noticed the shelves he stocked the customers he helped. His phone buzzed intermittently with updates from O'Connor, from Margaret, from numbers he didn't recognize, but suspected belonged to people who wanted statements. At noon, he stepped outside, air cold against his face, and checked his messages again. "They're calling me at 2. I wanted you to hear it from me." He typed back slowly. "Do you want me there?" The reply came after a pause. "I don't know. I don't want to drag you back into this." Frank stared at the screen. Drag. As if any of this had ever let him go. At 1:45, he left work early and drove downtown, parking 2 blocks from the building where the hearing was being held. He sat in the truck for a moment, hands on the wheel, listening to the city breathe. He wasn't required to be there. No subpoena, no obligation. He went anyway. The hearing room was smaller than a courtroom, paneled in dark wood, built for process rather than drama. Margaret sat at the table alone, hands folded, posture immaculate. She looked older there, Frank thought. Not fragile, seasoned, like someone who had spent a lifetime absorbing weight. When she saw him, her expression flickered just briefly. Not surprise. Something closer to resolve. The questioning was clinical. Dates, decisions, emails, motions. Margaret answered each one without hesitation. She spoke of standards and thresholds, of why certain actions fell within discretion. She never mentioned Frank by name. Then the questioning turned. Judge Collins, one of the panel members, said, "Did you have prior contact with the defendant in the Miller case?" Margaret's hands tightened slightly on the table. Frank felt it like a physical blow. "Yes," she said. I did. A murmur rippled through the room. Can you describe the nature of that contact? Margaret's gaze remained steady. I encountered him once outside of court, under circumstances unrelated to the case. Did that encounter influence your rulings? Margaret didn't answer immediately. She looked down, then up. It informed my attention. It did not alter my adherence to the law. The panel member leaned forward. That's a fine distinction. It's an essential one, Margaret replied. The hearing recessed after that. No conclusions, no decisions. Just uncertainty stretched thin. Outside, cameras waited. Margaret stepped past them without comment, shoulders squared. Frank followed at a distance, watching the familiar choreography of accusation take shape. They didn't speak until they reached his truck. I'm sorry, Margaret said quietly. I didn't want this. Frank opened the passenger door for her. You didn't cause it. She hesitated, then got in. They drove without speaking, the city sliding past in silence. Finally, Margaret broke it. I might lose my position, she said. Not the job I have now, but my eligibility to serve in any judicial capacity again. Frank nodded. And you're still standing. She looked at him. That's easy for you to say. No, he said. It's not. I've been where you are. When the story turns against you and waits to see if you'll fold. Margaret looked away, jaw tight. They stopped at a park near the river, the kind with benches worn smooth by time. Lucy's school let out in an hour. They had time. I don't regret what I did, Margaret said suddenly. Even now. Frank met her gaze. Good. Because I don't regret stopping that night, even knowing where it led. She studied him. You could have lost everything. I almost did, anyway, he replied. The difference is I know who I am now. Margaret exhaled slowly, some tension easing from her shoulders. That evening, Lucy noticed the shift immediately. Something big happened, she said, peering at Margaret over the table as they ate. Not bad big, just loud big. Margaret smiled faintly. You're perceptive. Lucy nodded. My teacher says that too. After Lucy went to bed, Frank and Margaret sat in the quiet living room, the only light coming from a lamp by the couch. Margaret held a mug she hadn't touched. If they rule against me, she said, I don't know what comes next. Frank considered her words, then spoke carefully. You'll still be you. That doesn't disappear with a title. She looked at him, something vulnerable flickering across her face. And what if that's not enough? Frank reached out, resting his hand over hers. It was enough for me. The decision came 2 weeks later. The panel issued a formal opinion. Margaret had failed to disclose prior contact, a procedural violation, no evidence of bias in the ruling, no overturning of the verdict. A public censure. A recommendation that she refrain from future judicial appointments. Margaret read the letter once, then folded it neatly and set it aside. I'm done with courts, she said that evening. Not bitter, just final. Frank nodded. Then we build something else. Lucy looked up from her drawing. Can we build a dog? Margaret laughed, genuine and surprised. That might be the hardest case yet. In the weeks that followed, the noise died down. New stories replaced the old. Margaret moved back to Ohio permanently, taking a consulting role that kept her busy but unburdened. Frank watched her shed layers of vigilance he hadn't realized she carried. One afternoon, as they sat on the porch watching Lucy chase leaves across the yard, Margaret spoke quietly. "I thought losing the bench would feel like failure." And Frank asked, "And it feels like relief." Frank smiled. He understood that. The world hadn't become kinder. Systems hadn't transformed overnight. But something had shifted irrevocably. They had chosen truth when it cost them. And now, in the quieter aftermath, they were learning how to live without armor. That Frank thought might be the real verdict. The house didn't change all at once. It shifted in small, almost unnoticeable ways, like a tide you only recognized once your feet were wet. Frank Miller noticed it in the mornings first. The kettle whistled earlier. Breakfast took longer. Someone else rinsed the mug he forgot in the sink. He would catch himself pausing in the doorway, listening to the soft overlap of voices, and feel a steadiness he hadn't known he was missing. Margaret Collins moved in slowly. Not with boxes stacked to the ceiling or declarations about permanence. Just a spare coat hung by the door. A pair of shoes lined neatly beside Frank's. A toothbrush that appeared one morning and never left. Lucy narrated each addition with solemn approval. "Those are good shoes," she announced the day Margaret set them down. "They mean you're staying." Margaret smiled. "I hope that's all right." Lucy nodded, already moving on. "It is." Work settled into rhythm. Frank learned the hardware store, like a second language, the weight of tools, the logic of aisles, the small talk that came easy when you weren't afraid of saying the wrong thing. Customers recognized him now. Some asked about the trial quietly. Most didn't. He answered what he wanted and let the rest pass. Margaret worked from home more often than not. Papers spread across the dining table, phone calls taken in the afternoon light. She advised, reviewed, suggested. She never ordered. Frank watched the way she approached problems, methodical but humane, and understood why people had listened when she spoke from the bench. On weekends, they drove without a destination. Back roads, old towns with faded signs and diners that still served coffee the right way. Lucy collected postcards and insisted on mailing them to Mrs. Reynolds, even though she lived 3 blocks away. "Mail is more special," she explained. One Sunday afternoon, as they sat on a park bench, watching Lucy climb and reclimb the same tree with unearned confidence, Margaret spoke without looking at Frank. "I don't miss it," she said. He knew what she meant. "That surprises you." "Yes," she admitted. "I thought stepping away would feel like shrinking. And," she considered, "it feels like breathing." Frank nodded. He understood that, too. There were nights he woke expecting the old panic, the calendar burning red behind his eyes. It never came. Instead, there was the quiet certainty of morning. The proposal happened without planning. No ring hidden in a drawer, no speech rehearsed in the mirror. It came on a Tuesday night when Lucy was asleep, and the rain tapped softly against the windows, a familiar sound now stripped of its threat. They were folding laundry together, standing close hands, brushing as they reached for the same towel. Frank paused, towel half-folded. "I don't want to assume," he said, "but I don't want to hesitate forever either." Margaret met his gaze. "Good." He swallowed. "Would you want to make this official?" "Not for the world. For us." She didn't answer right away. She stepped closer, placed her hands on his arms and searched his face like she was reading a record she trusted. "Yes," she said. "Simple. Certain." Lucy found out the next morning when she noticed Margaret wearing Frank's old watch, the one he took off before work. "Is that a clue?" she asked. Frank laughed. "It's not a clue. It's a yes." Lucy clapped her hands once. "I knew it." The wedding wasn't large. It wasn't rushed either. They chose spring, a garden owned by a retired couple who charged little and cared deeply. Margaret invited few colleagues. Frank invited fewer. Mrs. Reynolds cried through the entire ceremony. James O'Connor stood beside Frank, grinning like a man vindicated by something more than a verdict. Lucy insisted on wearing yellow. She walked ahead of them, scattering petals with dramatic flair, stopping halfway down the aisle to correct her aim. "These go on the ground," she whispered loudly. Margaret laughed, the sound unguarded, and Frank felt the weight of years lift from his shoulders. The vows were short, promises shaped by experience rather than fantasy. To tell the truth, to stop when stopping mattered, to listen when listening was hard, to choose each other without pretending it would always be easy. Afterward, as the light shifted and the guests drifted toward cake and conversation, Lucy tugged Margaret aside. "Now you're really my family," she said. "That means you can help with homework, and also secrets." Margaret knelt. "I can do both." Life after the wedding wasn't a finish line. It was a widening path. Challenges came smaller but persistent. Money still required attention. Lucy tested boundaries with the dedication of a scientist. Margaret learned the peculiar rhythms of Frank's silences, the way he needed time to think things through. They argued sometimes, quietly, then honestly, the kind of disagreements that clarified rather than wounded. Frank learned to say what he needed before it calcified into resentment. Margaret learned to rest without guilt. One evening, months later, Frank found Lucy at the kitchen table staring at a blank page. "Writer's block," she said gravely. "I have to write about heroes." Frank pulled out a chair. "What kind of heroes?" Lucy shrugged. "The kind who don't look like it." He smiled. "I know a few." She looked up, eyes bright. "Me too." As the year turned, the town settled back into its routines. The scandal faded into memory. Alan Pierce's name surfaced occasionally in legal updates, then less and less. Margaret's censure became a footnote. Frank's acquittal became a story told carefully without drama. They hosted Thanksgiving, for the first time folding chairs borrowed from neighbors, turkey, slightly overcooked laughter filling the room. Margaret carved with surprising confidence. Frank washed dishes. Lucy directed traffic. On New Year's Eve, they stood together on the porch, breath visible in the cold, watching distant fireworks bloom and fade. "I didn't know life could feel like this," Frank said quietly. Margaret leaned into him. "Neither did I." Lucy yawned. "Is this the part where everyone makes wishes?" Frank nodded. "You can if you want." She thought for a moment. "I wish people would stop and help each other more." Margaret smiled softly. "That's a good wish." Lucy nodded, satisfied, and went inside. Frank and Margaret stayed a moment longer, the night calm around them. Some stories ended with applause or headlines. Theirs ended with continuity, with shared mornings and honest evenings, with the knowledge that when the rain came, they would stop. They always would. And that they both knew was everything. The morning light came in gently, the way it only did after storms had spent themselves. Frank Miller stood at the kitchen window with a mug warming his hands, watching the neighborhood wake up. A delivery truck idled down the block. Someone laughed 2 houses over. Ordinary sounds, earned sounds, the kind you didn't hear when your head was full of fear. Margaret moved quietly behind him barefoot on the tile, tying her hair back with a familiarity that still surprised him sometimes. Lucy's backpack sat by the door, already packed a bright yellow ribbon tied to the zipper, because she said it helped the day start happy. Frank smiled at the thought. Happiness, he'd learned, wasn't loud. It was consistent. They had settled into a life that didn't announce itself. Mornings were early. Dinners were simple. The hardware store closed at 6. Margaret's work filled the afternoons with calls that mattered, but didn't consume her. Lucy's world expanded with spelling tests and scraped knees and long explanations about why things were the way they were. Frank listened more now. Margaret noticed everything. On a quiet Saturday, they drove to the river, where the city thinned and the water slowed. The bench near the bend had been repainted by volunteers, the wood still smelling faintly of varnish. Lucy skipped stones and counted each one out loud. Frank watched the ripples fade and thought about time, how it could compress whole lifetimes into moments and then stretch moments into something that carried you forward. Margaret sat beside him, coat folded over her arm. "Do you ever think about that night?" she asked. Frank nodded. "I think about stopping." She leaned back, eyes on the water. "I think about being stranded, about how strange it is that everything can hinge on a small decision." They sat in that shared understanding. Not romantic, not solemn. Real. In the weeks that followed, small things confirmed the shape of their life. Lucy brought home a certificate for kindness. Frank was asked to train a new hire and realized he enjoyed teaching. Margaret was invited to speak at a community center about ethics and accountability, and she accepted, not because it would be seen, but because it would be useful. The talk drew a modest crowd. Retirees, students, a few parents with notebooks. Margaret spoke plainly without grandeur about systems and people and the spaces where they failed each other. She spoke about the cost of looking away. She did not tell Frank's story. She didn't need to. The room listened anyway. Afterward, an older man with a cane approached Frank. "I watched that case," he said quietly. "Glad you got through it." Frank nodded. "Me too." The man squeezed his shoulder once and moved on. No speeches, no apologies, just recognition. That night, Lucy insisted on making dinner. It was mostly sandwiches, assembled with ceremonial seriousness. Margaret pretended not to notice the peanut butter on the counter. Frank pretended not to notice the uneven slices. They ate and laughed and cleaned up together. Later, when the house settled and the day softened into quiet, Frank found himself in the doorway again, watching Lucy sleep. The fear that once lived there had faded, replaced by a steady gratitude that didn't demand repayment. He turned off the light and closed the door. Margaret joined him in the living room, handing him a folded paper. "I found this in a book," she said. "I think it's yours." It was the note from long ago, worn at the edges. "You're free. Don't waste it." Frank folded it carefully and slid it back into his wallet. I won't. Spring arrived without ceremony. Trees budded. Lawns greened. The city carried on. Frank fixed a neighbor's fence on a Sunday afternoon and refused payment. Margaret helped a young attorney navigate a hard choice. Lucy learned to ride her bike without training wheels, wobbling and laughing and falling once before she found her balance. They celebrated quietly. Ice cream on the porch, sticky fingers, a picture taped to the refrigerator. Life did not become perfect. It became honest. On the anniversary of the trial's end, Frank took the day off. They drove the back roads again, stopped at a diner that still used real plates, and poured coffee without asking. The waitress recognized Margaret, but couldn't place her. Frank liked that. As they ate, Lucy leaned across the table. "Do you think people change?" she asked. Frank considered the question without urgency. "I think people choose." Margaret nodded. "And sometimes they keep choosing." Lucy smiled, satisfied, and went back to her pancakes. That evening they returned home. As the sun dipped low, the sky streaked with color that felt unearned and generous. Frank stood on the porch and watched the light fade, aware of how far he had come without feeling the need to measure it. He thought of the man he had been when the handcuffs closed, when the story seemed finished. He thought of the woman in the rain, and the woman at the bench, and the woman in his home, now all the same person, all changed by choice. Margaret stood beside him, her hand fitting into his like it always had. Lucy leaned against his leg, warm and present. There were no speeches to give, no lessons to underline, just a truth that had proved itself again and again. When the rain comes, stop if you can. When the truth is heavy, carry it anyway. When someone listens, let that be enough. If this story moved you, like the video, subscribe for more stories that believe in quiet courage, and share your thoughts below with these 3 words: pay it forward.